Slavoj Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology, first published in 1989, marked a turning point in both the study of ideology and psychoanalytic theory. Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher and cultural critic, blends Lacanian psychoanalysis with Marxist theory, arguing that ideology is not just a set of political beliefs but deeply embedded in our daily lives, shaping our very perception of reality. The book challenges traditional Marxist understandings of ideology, introducing new ways of thinking about the function of ideological fantasy, the real, and the symbolic order. Žižek's work is renowned for its complexity, blending philosophy, psychoanalysis, and pop culture references. Ideology and fantasy. In this book, Žižek explores the relationship between ideology and fantasy, proposing that ideology operates at the level of fantasy, helping individuals avoid the traumatic aspects of the real. In Žižek's reading of Lacanian psychoanalysis, the real is something that resists symbolization and language, often being traumatic and disruptive. He argues that ideology serves to maintain the symbolic order by offering a fantasy that conceals the fundamental lack or void in the social structure. This fantasy structure is what makes ideology so powerful and resistant to change. For Žižek, fantasy is not merely an illusion or false consciousness, as it was for classical Marxist thinkers. Instead, fantasy is a necessary support for the social order, offering individuals a way to cope with the inherent inconsistencies and contradictions of society. It allows us to believe in the symbolic order despite its flaws. The fantasy structure of ideology helps to maintain social cohesion by giving people a narrative or symbolic framework through which to interpret their experiences and the world around them, the Lacanian real. One of Žižek's most significant contributions in the Sublime Object of Ideology is his use of Jacques Lacan's concept of the real. Lacan, a French psychoanalyst, developed the idea that human experience is structured around three registers: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is the realm of images and identifications, the symbolic is the domain of language and social structures, and the real is what lies outside language and is beyond our capacity to symbolize. The real is often experienced as a traumatic rupture in the social order. Žižek argues that ideology functions to manage our relationship to the real, helping to contain its disruptive effects. Ideology, in this sense, is not just about concealing the truth but managing the gap between the symbolic order and the real. This gap is inevitable, as no symbolic system can fully capture the complexity of reality. Ideology steps in to offer a fantasy structure that makes the symbolic order appear coherent, even though it is riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. Cynicism and ideology. One of the more provocative aspects of Žižek's argument is his discussion of cynicism and ideology. In contrast to classical Marxist views, where ideology is seen as a form of false consciousness, Žižek argues that contemporary ideology often operates in a more cynical mode. He refers to what he calls cynical reason, where individuals are fully aware of the contradictions and absurdities of the system but continue to act as if they believe in it. People might know that political leaders or economic systems are flawed, yet they continue to participate in the structures that uphold these systems. This cynicism, Žižek argues, is not a sign of the decline of ideology but of its continuing power. The very act of acknowledging the flaws in the system without doing anything to change it is, in fact, a way of maintaining the system. Ideology, in this sense, operates not at the level of belief but at the level of action. We might not believe in the system, but we continue to act as if we do, and this action is what sustains ideological structures. The Sublime Object. The title of Žižek's book refers to his idea of the sublime object of ideology, which draws on both Lacanian psychoanalysis and Immanuel Kant's philosophy. For Kant, the sublime is something that is beyond our capacity to understand or represent fully, something that evokes both awe and fear. Žižek uses this idea to describe the object of ideology, which functions as something sublime, an unattainable object of desire that organizes our actions and beliefs. This sublime object is not something we can ever fully grasp or achieve, yet it remains the driving force behind our participation in ideological structures. In Lacanian terms, the sublime object is connected to what Lacan calls the objet petit, or the unattainable object of desire that always eludes us. For Žižek, ideology offers us a version of this object, something that promises to fill the gap in the symbolic order and provide a sense of wholeness or completeness. However, this object is always just out of reach, and it is this very inaccessibility that keeps us invested in the ideological system. Žižek's critique of postmodernism. In the Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek also critiques postmodern approaches to ideology, particularly those that emphasize pluralism and relativism. For Žižek, these approaches fail to recognize the persistence of the real and the role of fantasy in sustaining ideological structures. Postmodernism, with its emphasis on the fragmentation of meaning and the rejection of grand narratives, overlooks the way in which ideology continues to function through fantasy and the sublimation of desire. Žižek argues that postmodernism often fails to address the deeper structures of power and ideology, instead focusing on surface-level critiques of representation and discourse. In this way, postmodern critiques of ideology can sometimes reinforce the very systems they aim to challenge. By emphasizing pluralism and the multiplicity of meanings, postmodernism can obscure the underlying fantasies that sustain ideological structures. Ideological interpolation. Žižek builds on Louis Althusser's concept of ideological interpolation, the process by which individuals are hailed or called into social roles by ideology. Althusser argued that ideology works by addressing individuals as subjects, making them recognize themselves within the ideological framework. Žižek takes this idea further by suggesting that ideology does not simply impose an identity on individuals but also structures their very desire. For Žižek, ideology not only calls us into subject positions but also offers us fantasies that shape our desires and motivations. These fantasies give us a sense of purpose and direction within the social order, even if that purpose is based on an illusory or unattainable object. Ideological interpolation, in Žižek's view, is not just about being recognized as a subject but about being drawn into a structure of desire that keeps the social system functioning. The role of enjoyment. A key element of Žižek's theory of ideology is his focus on the role of enjoyment or jouissance, a concept derived from Lacan. Žižek argues that ideology is not just about belief or consent but also about enjoyment. Ideological fantasies offer us a form of enjoyment, even if that enjoyment is tinged with suffering or frustration. This enjoyment is what keeps us invested in the ideological system, even when we are aware of its contradictions and flaws. For Žižek, enjoyment is a central part of the way ideology operates. It is not enough to simply understand ideology at the level of ideas or beliefs, we must also consider the ways in which ideology structures our desires and provides us with forms of enjoyment. This enjoyment can take many forms, from the pleasure of consumption in capitalist societies to the satisfaction of moral righteousness in political movements. In the Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek offers a radical rethinking of the role of ideology in contemporary society. By drawing on Lacanian psychoanalysis, he challenges traditional Marxist views of ideology as false consciousness and instead highlights the ways in which ideology functions through fantasy, desire, and enjoyment. Žižek's work emphasizes the complexity of ideology, showing how it operates at both the level of belief and the level of action, sustaining social structures through a combination of fantasy and cynical reason. His insights continue to shape debates in philosophy, psychoanalysis, and political theory, offering a new lens through which to understand the power of ideology in the modern world.